Some neighbors here had complained of a stench for almost a year, but they never imagined what might be causing it. Milwaukee police were led to an apartment in this building after they were flagged down by a handcuffed man who claimed he had been attacked. What they discovered upon their arrival was almost unspeakable. Numerous pieces from as many as 15 human bodies, including 3 heads preserved in a refrigerator.
It's obvious that there has been a number of human specimens found within the apartment, and to a certain extent they have been there sometime.
A hazardous materials team, breathing from air tanks, confiscated a number of items from the suspect's apartment. Among them, police say, photographs and drawings of dead, mutilated bodies and a vat of acid. Police believe the suspect may have used the acid to dissolve body parts. Neighbors also say they heard sawing in the apartment at all hours of the day and night.
And now we found out he's got dead bodies in it.
What's your reaction on this?
It's shocking. It's terrible, you know. And here I stay right across the hall from this guy.
Police aren't certain if all of the murders occurred here in Milwaukee. They are reviewing missing persons files and closely communicating with other law enforcement agencies in hopes that evidence collected at the scene might help identify the victims. Brad Woodard for NBC News, Milwaukee.
Thank you, Brian.
You want me to hit him?
Ann?
I'll talk to you later, Brian. In the news this morning, on a serious note, police in Wisconsin this morning are investigating a grisly discovery in a Milwaukee apartment, the discovery of pieces of bodies. Police found parts of as many as 15 human bodies inside. Police were led there by a man who told them he'd been attacked with a butcher knife. Police are questioning the 31-year-old man who lives in the apartment. A Milwaukee newspaper is reporting the man has confessed to killing at least 11 people. At Cape Canaveral, NASA has scrubbed this morning's launch of the shuttle Atlantis.
On to the news desk. Ann?
Thanks, Brian. In the news this morning, a 31-year-old man in Milwaukee has reportedly confessed to killing at least 11 men and to practicing cannibalism. Police on Tuesday found numerous body parts in the man's apartment, as well as a dresser full of photographs and drawings of mutilated bodies. Investigators believe that as many as 15 men may have been killed. The shuttle Atlantis will not lift off into space today. NASA postponed today's.
In order to convince Cheney that the program was on track. Ann?
Thank you very much. Henry Champ reporting from Washington. In Milwaukee, police are still trying to identify the numerous murder victims found in a local apartment. Jeffrey Dahmer, the 31-year-old tenant, is in custody and has confessed to killing the 11 people found in his apartment and maybe more. Paul Hogan reports that the mother of one victim has been given the terrible news.
I had to feel.
Milwaukee police told Catherine Lacey last night her 23-year-old son Oliver, who vanished 2 weeks ago, is dead.
It's really puzzling to me.
Her son's remains were the first to be identified from the severed skulls and limbs taken from this apartment building Monday night. Later today, 31-year-old chocolate factory worker Jeffrey Dahmer will be charged with Lacey's murder, and more charges are sure to follow.
There are 11 individuals or parts thereof that were recovered, and those would include 11 intact skulls.
He just said that I'm the one responsible for what I have done.
Dahmer's attorney says his client is confessing to up to 18 murders over the past several years because it's time to tell the truth.
This is a very sick young man who has many kind of mental problems.
Jeffrey Dahmer remains jailed on $1 million bond while his attorney prepares an expected insanity defense. From Milwaukee, Paul Hogan for NBC News.
Mikhail Gorbachev's reform policies are on the line in Moscow today at a...
Ann Bernard, NBC News, Milwaukee.
It's a frightening thought indeed. Dr. John Hunter is with us now from affiliate WAVY in Norfolk, Virginia for some answers. He is the Director of Behavioral Studies at the Pines Treatment Center there. Good morning.
Good morning.
Was there any way, sir, to detect that Jeffrey Dahmer's criminal behavior was going to progress the way it did?
Well, I think that it's important to note that most people who are sexual offenders do not progress to the point that they actually commit homicide. I think it's relatively rare. But the thing that I heard that was very important is that there were signs that the problem was there from an early age. It's very rare for an adult to begin to sexually act out as an adult. It usually begins as a juvenile.
When he was released from prison after he served time for child molestation, his father pleaded for treatment, and there's no evidence that he actually got any. Is that unusual for a convicted child molester not to receive treatment?
It's not at all unusual. In fact, most child molesters go undetected, and then they are either never referred to treatment, or the kind of treatment that they're referred to is not specialized enough to be effective. Most people who go to prison simply do not receive the kind of treatment in prison that they need, or they receive no treatment at all. And then once they're out of prison, it's simply they're a free person, and they don't have any therapy at that point either.
Is that the fault of the legal system?
Well, the legal system, I think, has to be interfaced with the people providing the treatment services, and that's imperative. You cannot treat sexual offenders, in my opinion, either juveniles or adults, without the aid of the legal system. They have to be there as a backup.
Is there appropriate treatment available?
Treatment does work, and I think that's important for people to remember. It's the kind of treatment, and there are some people who are not treatable. But certainly if you get most of these people into the right kind of treatment, it will be successful.
With people not getting the kind of treatment needed, though, what's the best way to protect our kids? Is there a way?
Well, I think that you have to believe children, and that's something that I've talked about from time to time. If a child tells you that they feel uncomfortable around an adult, you need to listen to them as to why. If they tell you that they have been victimized, you need to believe them. Too many children are left unprotected, left to the care of people who exploit them.
All right, thank you, Dr. Hunter. We're back in a moment with more on Today after this.
Or 8:01, let's go to the news desk.
It's a long story.
Ann Curry.
Thanks, Brian. In the news this morning, the work of identifying human remains continues in Milwaukee as police press on their investigation of a ghastly multiple murder. Meanwhile, prime suspect Jeffrey Dahmer is being linked to mysterious deaths in other states and perhaps overseas. More from Paul Hogan.
Second, is that correct? That's correct, Your Honor.
Jeffrey Dahmer told the judge he understood the murder charges lodged against him, and though he appeared calm and unemotional, his attorney says he's actually distraught.
He's a very desperate young man. He is very troubled, and he is in a high anxious mood because of what has happened.
The suspect may well have been involved in at least 17 homicides.
Police say they've widened their murder probe to include every place Dahmer ever lived or visited. Illinois, Ohio, Florida, even Germany, where 5 unsolved dismemberment slayings occurred in the early 80s when Dahmer was an Army private stationed there. They are convinced Dahmer has been on a murder spree for over a decade.
The information we received has ranged over a period of that time.
What time? 10 years?
At least.
6 of Dahmer's victims have already been identified, and the coroner here believes 4 more should be identified by later today. From Milwaukee, Paul Hogan for NBC News.
A senior U.S. official is in Hanoi today looking for information about the photograph that some say governed the Soviet Union since communism took control nearly 3/4 of a century ago. Officials in other states and at least one other country have some grim questions about a suspect being held in Milwaukee. Jeffrey Dahmer has been formally charged with the deaths of 4 people, but police say he's been linked to many more murders. He's said to have confessed to killing 11 men, and the investigation is even widening to Germany. That's where Dahmer served in the U.S. Army in the early 1980s.
Is that correct?
New doubts are being expressed about the photograph said to show 3 Americans who have been missing. Israel has still not replied to America's invitation to attend a regional peace conference. Investigators in Ohio have gone to work on reports that the bloody legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer may have begun there more than a dozen years ago. Dahmer has already admitted to killing 11 people whose remains were found in his Milwaukee apartment last week. More from John Hoylman in Milwaukee.
Pastor Dean Nelson spent his Sunday trying to heal the wounds of the past week. Nelson's church is just 7 blocks from Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment.
What makes this particular incident such a tragedy is that it seems that all along Mr. Dahmer's life there could have been ways of intercepting and changing what has grown to be such a great tragedy.
While he prayed for the victims and their families, Pastor Nelson said the pain extends much further, encompassing the entire Milwaukee area and more. But while they preach, the story continues to take on new and tragic dimensions. Police in Ohio say Dahmer confessed to killing a 19-year-old hitchhiker in their state back in 1978. They say Dahmer identified Stephen Hicks as the man he killed at his parents' house near Akron.
We feel that Stephen Hicks was probably the victim of Jeffrey Dahmer.
A human bone was found on the property where Dahmer lived with his parents 13 years ago. Ohio investigators plan to dig up the yard tomorrow to search for more remains. Hicks is believed to be the first victim in what became a string of murders and mutilations. John Hoylman for NBC News, Milwaukee.
In Los Angeles yesterday, just 27 Dodger batters came to the plate.
Healthier meals. All natural Pam, a healthier way to cook.
Investigators today turned up more than 24 human bone parts in the yard of Jeffrey Dahmer's boyhood home in Ohio. But Dahmer is accused of doing most of his killing in Milwaukee, and people there are starting to ask the police some hard questions. NBC's Jim Cummins.
As authorities in Ohio continued their search for the first of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims, the people in Milwaukee continue to search for an answer to this question. Why wasn't Dahmer arrested sooner, before he had a chance to murder as many as 17 people, most of them gay African Americans? There's a lot of anger and suspicion among both groups.
We want somebody that's going to investigate the police department. You didn't say nothing about this white boy over here killing us over here.
Not only were these men the victims of a mass murder, but also of a police department that did not even notice.
By the time police found the remains of 11 victims in his apartment, the authorities had encountered Jeffrey Dahmer several times. He was convicted in 1989 of sexually molesting a boy. After Dahmer was paroled, his father wrote a letter to the judge urging him to get help for his son. Then, little more than 2 months ago, the neighbors called police when this 14-year-old, a brother of the boy Dahmer molested, was seen running naked and bleeding from Dahmer's apartment. The police returned the boy to Dahmer after he said they were lovers. The boy's body was among those found in the apartment. Minority leaders are outraged.
The police turned over that bleeding boy and then to the killer, to butcher. And if that would be another person, or if that boy be white, could it be different?
A growing number of minority groups in other cities are tired of waiting for the police to act. They are taking the law into their own hands. Police officials admit officers are usually more responsive to complaints from white, more affluent neighborhoods.
The wealthy person is more likely to be an articulate person. They're more likely to be one that the officer thinks is going to follow through. The officer may also think that they're going to be more likely to complain if it isn't handled by the book.
Today there was a memorial service for 31-year-old Anthony Hughes, one of the victims found in Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. Jim Cummins, NBC News.
Running a business in one of our national parks means getting a break from the government. That means big
Icon share dwindling from 90% to as little as 20%. In Ohio, the search continues in and around the boyhood home of accused multiple killer Jeffrey Dahmer. More than 50 pieces of bone have been discovered. The local county coroner says 70% of the bones appear to be human. Dahmer is in jail in Milwaukee, where police say he has confessed to 17 killings. Searchers are looking through the ruins of an apartment building in Detroit's North Side. Years ago, Anderson is one of 6 American hostages. 8 more murder charges have been filed against accused multiple killer Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer, who has admitted 17 killings, now stands formally charged with 12 of them. A judge in Milwaukee has also raised his bail to $5 million. Veteran television newsman Harry Reasoner has died in Connecticut. He was 6. Indicted on rape charges. Tyson says he's innocent of the charges. Milwaukee mass murder suspect Jeffrey Dahmer has pleaded innocent by reason of insanity to 15 murder counts. Relatives of some of his victims were in the courtroom.
I think that he knew exactly what he was doing and how he was going to do it. There's nothing wrong with Jeffrey Dahmer.
Dahmer's trial has been scheduled to begin in late January. In Kuwait, oil experts have reached the halfway point in their efforts.
Has reportedly confessed to several of the killings. In Milwaukee on Monday, Jeffrey Dahmer pleaded guilty to killing 15 young men. Under Wisconsin law, there must now be a sanity hearing. Dahmer's lawyer will try to prove his client was insane, while prosecutors argue that he knew what he was doing. In Washington, this is the first full day of direct peace talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
News, Indianapolis.
In Milwaukee today, police detectives who took Jeffrey Dahmer's confession will continue their testimony at his sanity trial. As testimony began on Thursday, a prosecutor said Dahmer carefully chose his victims for his fantasies of sex and death. Dahmer has admitted killing and dismembering 15 young men, but his lawyers insist he was mentally ill and tried to control his compulsions. In Florida, Eileen Wuornos hears her life or death sentence today.
Their countries trying to develop nuclear weapons. In Milwaukee, the Jeffrey Dahmer sanity trial could go to jury today. The jury will decide if Dahmer should go to prison or to a mental institution for the murders of 15 people. His lawyer says Dahmer won't take the stand himself. Forecasters are warning that another storm bearing down on California may mean.
For reservations, call your travel agent.
The case against Jeffrey Dahmer comes to a close today when he is sentenced later this morning in a Milwaukee courtroom.
Did the defendant, Jeffrey L. Dahmer, have a mental disease? Answer, no.
After 2 weeks of disturbing testimony, the jury found Dahmer legally sane when he murdered and dismembered his 15 victims over a 13-year period. The prosecutor of the case is Milwaukee County District Attorney Michael McCann, and he's in our Milwaukee affiliate, WTMJ, this morning. Mr. McCann, good morning.
Good morning, Katie.
What do you expect will happen this morning in terms of Dahmer's sentencing?
Well, we first have the family speak. Under our state law, each family has an opportunity to express to the court the impact of this offense on their family. As a result, I think we'll see a highly charged emotional statements by the family, and then a statement perhaps by the defense. That's an option for the defendant. Then our office will speak, and I suspect there's going to be some very heavy, substantial sentences handed down.
Why do you think the families are getting, why should the families be getting an opportunity to speak this morning in the courtroom? Why is that important in your view?
It's a reflection of the victim movement of the last 10 or 15 years. I was with the ABA Victims Committee, and we fought for that across the country to see that victims would be able to tell the court before sentencing. Always, of course, the defendant has had what we call the right of allocution to speak before sentencing. The defendants have had that since time immemorial. And in the last 10 years, now you see families of victims, and victims where there's not a homicide, speaking to the court, telling the court directly what the impact has been on them. I think that's very important for a court to hand down a proper judgment. The court should fully appreciate the loss that these families have had.
You say we should expect a pretty stiff sentence. I mean, he's eligible for what, life sentences, 15 life sentences.
Yes, I think he should never again be on the streets of any city in the United States. I suspect the sentence will be such that he will never again be a danger to anyone in the United States.
Does that mean he'll never be eligible for parole?
I would certainly hope so. Under our state statutes, it's up to the judge. At least in the last 13 of the 15 counts, the judge can set a parole date beyond any possibility of release.
What about when he enters the prison sentence system, rather? Will he be in solitary confinement, do you believe?
Well, I would think so. There's some concern about suicide, obviously. That concern has prevailed since the time of his arrest. I think there will also be concern how he might be received by the prisoner population. It's difficult to assess that. So there's concern that something not happen to him. I think if the opportunity is pursued by him and he really wishes some psychiatric help, I think he can get it. He suffers from what's called a paraphilia of intense sexual urges, fantasies. It's something he never dealt with. We offered him that opportunity when he was first convicted of indecent exposure in our community. He rejected that psychological help. Now it's going to be up to him whether he pursues that or continues to pursue his fantasies.
What do you think was the most influential testimony that led the jury to decide he wasn't legally insane?
I think it was probably the testimony of psychiatrist Park Elliott Dietz. He had headed the government effort in the Hinckley case. He was worked with the FBI in serial killings. He's an extremely capable man. It was a pleasure to work with him. He's situated out in California, and I think we were fortunate to have his services.
Do you think that, I know that his attorney, Dahmer's attorney, decided not to have Dahmer take the stand, instead to allow his police confession to speak for him. Do you think that hurt the defense's case?
No, I don't think it was. We, of course, taped his interview with Dr. Dietz. Mr. Dahmer is not insane in any sense. He is not psychotic. He is fully in contact with reality. He has, in my opinion, a superior intelligence, and I think the jury would immediately have seen, just a minute, there's nothing really wrong with this man in terms of hallucinations, in terms of delusions. I think people are willing to accept a type of insanity defense where there's a genuine separation from reality. This type of disorder that this man has, a sexual disorder, does not put him out of contact with reality in any sense of the word.
How do you think this whole grisly trial, Mr. McCann, has affected the Milwaukee community?
Well, Milwaukee is a wonderful city. I went to, as a student, I lived in Detroit, Washington, D.C., and Boston. They're wonderful cities, but I came back to Milwaukee because it's a very, very special place. I don't think it affects really the real quality of life in our city. Whether it affects the image, I can't tell. But I can assure you of this is a splendid community. It's caused some difficulty in our community, but it will be healed.
All right. Michael McCann, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Love in Black and White. Brian's back with the story of the rise in interracial marriages. But first,
hacked 3 Israeli soldiers to death in the occupied West Bank. Back in court in Milwaukee today, serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer for a sentencing hearing. Over the weekend, a jury ruled that Dahmer was sane when he murdered and dismembered 15 young men. He faces a mandatory sentence of life in prison for each killing. Today's hearing will determine if the sentences run concurrently. Firefighters in Woodstock, Alabama spent most of the night controlling a fire at a plastics plant. The threat of
Red Lobster's World of Lobster.
Some real-life drama today in a Milwaukee courtroom. Serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms without parole in the killings of 15 young men and boys. The sentencing followed courtroom statements from relatives of the victims and from Dahmer himself.
Never, Jeffrey! Jeffrey! I hate you! This is out of control! Don't with me, Jeffrey! I'll kill you! Look at me! You took my mother's oldest grandchild from her, and for that I can never forgive you. I hope you can deal with what you've done.
And for the first time, Dahmer spoke publicly about the murders.
This has never been a case of trying to get free. I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself. I feel so bad for what I did to those poor families, and I understand their rightful hate. I know I will be in prison for the rest of my life. I know that I will have to turn to God to help me get through each day. I should have stayed with God. I tried and failed and created a Holocaust.
Dahmer said if it would bring back those he killed, he would give his own life right now. Justice takes many forms, of course. A court decision is at the center of a small town controversy which has split a community and
Christmas time in Albany, New York. Here's Brian.
All right, Willard. Thanks very much. Coming up on 7/11 now, and on Close-Up this morning, Jeffrey Dahmer. Though few are mourning his death, the fact that he was murdered by another inmate while he was behind bars is a source of concern to the man who oversees Wisconsin's prison system. That man is Michael Sullivan, the Secretary of the Wisconsin Corrections Department. He's in Madison. Mr. Sullivan, good morning.
Good morning, Brian.
What can you tell us, sir, about Christopher Scarver, the man you're holding in connection with Dahmer's death? Has he yet been officially charged?
He has not yet been officially charged. He is an individual from Milwaukee County who was convicted of first-degree intentional homicide while armed and was given a parole eligibility date of the year 2042.
Do you yet have a motive in the death of Dahmer?
No, we are waiting for the Columbia Sheriff's Department to finish their investigation, at which time we hope to have a better understanding of the motive behind the killing.
Since Mr. Scarver is an African American and since a disproportionate amount of Mr. Dahmer's victims were also African American, are you assuming that race was a motivating factor?
I am not assuming race was a motivating factor with the information that I have at this time. In fact, we believe it is not a factor in this instance.
Other than being of the same race, did Mr. Scarver have any connection at all with any of Mr. Dahmer's victims that you yet know of?
No, there is no connection with any of the victims that we are aware of.
You have one suspect in custody. Are you satisfied at this point that he was acting alone?
At this point, I am satisfied he is acting alone with the facts that are before me, but the Sheriff's Department and the Department of Justice will make the final determination on that.
So you're not discounting the possibility that he was part of some larger conspiracy?
I never discount anything, but again, I do not believe it was a conspiracy.
Given his crimes, Mr. Sullivan, and an earlier attack on his life, why wasn't Mr. Dahmer in special protective custody at the time he was killed?
It was our conclusion, which Mr. Dahmer agreed with, that the previous attack was an isolated incident by an individual who was trying to do something that he would be noticed for so that he could be exported out of the country back to his home country.
So you concluded that he was not at undue risk by being put in a housing unit with other dangerous criminals?
That is correct.
Help me out with the timetable on this, if you might. Was he supposed to have been under supervision at all times?
With the status he was in yesterday, he was not to be under direct supervision by staff at all times. He had been in a status in the housing unit he was in where he could leave the housing unit to go to a job situation and do that work, which would mean that he would not be continuously supervised.
Help me again on the timing here. He was supposedly escorted into the gymnasium area where he was killed at about 7:50. Reportedly, his body was found at about 8:10. During those 15 minutes, where were the staff personnel who were supposed to be watching over him?
At this time, I do not have exact information on whereabouts and activities of staff who were in the gymnasium at that particular time. That is being determined by the investigating Sheriff's Department.
Jesse Anderson also sustained injuries in the attack. Do you know of any relationship between Anderson and Dahmer?
No, I do not. I met with Mr. Anderson's family last night, and there is no connection that they are aware of, nor that I am aware of.
Bottom line, Mr. Sullivan, do you or other prison officials accept any responsibility for the killing of Mr. Dahmer? Should you have done a better job of protecting him, or should we view this as the natural consequence of a man like Dahmer being locked up with other dangerous people?
Well, I certainly do not consider this a national consequence. I consider this a real tragedy. It is something that we did not expect, and had we been aware of something pending, we certainly would have taken preventative action. We will be reviewing policies and procedures, and there are very likely to be modifications as to how we handle these situations in the future.
Michael Sullivan, you're a busy man. Thank you for joining us, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian.
Been hospitalized for the past 2 weeks after he was hit by a car. Prison officials in Wisconsin today continue their investigation into Monday's killing of mass murderer Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer was serving multiple life terms for killing and dismembering 17 people. He was beaten to death Monday in prison. There was strong reaction from relatives of some of his victims.
That I am happy and very excited that the monster is finally dead. I've never said he was never mental, he was never sick, he was nothing but plain evil.
Prison officials are holding another inmate, Christopher Scarver, in connection with Dahmer's murder. Officials in northeastern China are trying to find out what caused a deadly fire at a crowded dance hall.